All right, so welcome everyone to session B1 of the 2023 Online Writing Centers Association Virtual Conference. Again, my name is Brie LaFond. I'm chair of the OWCA's Virtual Events Committee. I'll be moderating the session today along with Madeline Carroll, who is our accessibility chair. So during this session, presenter Laura Widman will facilitate a roundtable discussion entitled Developing Multimodal Feedback for ESL Writers. So we're going to take note of some participation guidelines before we get started. First, please note, as you kind of heard just a moment ago, we are recording today's session. If you have a question or a comment, but you'd prefer not to be recorded for whatever reason, please feel free to use the chat to communicate today. Next, please note that we have sign language interpreters with us today from Moore Interpreting LLC. The interpreters should be spotlighted throughout the talk today, but if you can't see them at any point, please send a direct message either to myself or to Madeline, and we will get that set up for you. We ask that you refrain from turning on your own audio unless you are actively speaking. So again, though, please feel free to post comments or questions in the chat at any time. And then finally, here's a refresher, even though we all live on Zoom, here's a reminder how to get to that chat box. So the button to get to the chat should be at the bottom of the screen. It's highlighted here with the purple arrow. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen and hand things over to Laura. Laura, please get us started.
Thank you so much, Brie. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this roundtable discussion about developing multimodal feedback for ESL writers. My name is Laura Widman, and I am the ESL specialist at the Texas A&M University Writing Center. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm white with short brunette hair and round tortoiseshell glasses. This presentation is structured as a roundtable discussion, which means that for much of this time, we will be able to share our thoughts on the topics introduced. During discussion times, you are invited to raise your hand and unmute yourself when called upon to share your thoughts or type out your thoughts and questions in the chat at any time. Any typed questions or comments will be read aloud for the benefit of all attendees. And while I am reading scripted portions of this presentation and introducing new topics, if you have a question or comment, please type it in the chat so that this contribution can be acknowledged at an appropriate time and we can get through the material I would like for us to cover today. You should have access to both the transcript and the handout for this discussion at this time, but I've also shared them in the chat for your convenience. The handout contains some helpful vocabulary terms, the subsections of my presentation, and some guiding questions for each section. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to acknowledge that I am presenting from the unjustly taken territory of the Coahuiltecan, the Sana, the Tonkawa, and the Wichita and affiliated peoples. The purpose of this acknowledgement is to understand our role in the history of our institution's land, to uphold the continuing presence and importance of Indigenous culture and rights on this land, and to support Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, support, and recognition. Within my transcript for this talk is more information about each of these tribes and how you can support and learn more about those who have sustained Indigenous community and territory in spite of the injustices committed against them. So moving on to this roundtable discussion's topic, ESL writing, or L2 writing, is a relatively new field of study in pedagogy. L2 writing scholar Paul K. Matsuda, in his piece Second Language Writing in the 20th Century, A Situated Historical Perspective, documents this history and development of L2 writing as a field. Coming into prominence in the 1960s separately as a subfield of L2 instruction and an approach to writing in English departments, much of this development was in response to the rapidly growing population of international students in American colleges and universities. L2 writing instruction has, historically, been left to ESL programs until a writer is deemed competent enough in English writing to join first-year composition courses, after which L2 writers are often taught in the same manner as L1 English writers. In the 1970s through 80s, L2 writing instruction and pedagogical development formed a stronger presence in English and composition programs, and thus became a more interdisciplinary field. Although still often bisected by the writer's perceived skill in the language, Matsuda further argues that this shared pedagogical identity within numerous fields is necessary for the development of L2 writing. Building from this historical perspective, it is also important to consider that L2 writers are not a monolith and often share a wide range of intersectional identities that changes how they are viewed and treated within the U.S. educational system. L2 writers will face varying difficulties and discrimination based upon their foundation in English, their accent, citizenship, home country, race, religion, and much more. These identities can further influence how they are treated in the U.S. and how people judge their capabilities in English communication. With the analysis from Matsuda and intersecting identities in mind, it is necessary to evaluate how L2 writers are treated within the Writing Center. Considering this and our own experiences with ESL writing or L2 writing in our own writing centers, let's consider, and these questions are also on the handout if you're reading off of that, what does the history of L2 English writing tell us about the present and future of L2 English writing? What knowledge of L2 writing should be kept in mind when considering ESL writers separately from monolingual writers? How does your writing center teach tutors to interact with and tutor ESL writers? How much of this is by design or due to uncontested biases or judgments? Does this teaching reinforce any existing assumptions about ESL writers? And what intersecting identities do you see in L2 writers? Open to anyone who would like to begin the discussion.
Laura, could we maybe break those down a little bit, or perhaps share, for those who don't have the handout in front of them, share the text in the chat?
Yes, I will copy and paste those questions into the chat, but those are just guiding questions. If you have any thoughts outside of them or in addition to them, I welcome that. Yinka?
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions to get us started. So I also identify as an L2 writer. So whenever my students come to the Writing Center, I have this empathy towards them, especially when they start apologizing that, oh, I'm sorry, English is not my first language. Oh, I'm sorry. So you see them being apologetic. Then secondly, you see them center the need for grammar. And so they are so worried about their grammar. So we are trained to nudge them towards global comments, but the fear is present, the anxiety is present. So I think this conversation is very needful, especially for those who don't understand the experience of being an L2. So I think it's a very needful thing. So one, I reassure them that you don't have to apologize. Then I also relate with their experience that I'm also an L2 speaker. Then I let them to see that your multilingual abilities are an asset, so not a disability. So I'm always more mindful when I have such students that I'm working with, just to create that supportive space. Their writing is serious, they are concerned. At the same time, they have this extra baggage of not being good enough with English.
Thank you so much for your input. I think that's something that a lot of us have experienced, is needing to reassure our ESL writers who come in that they don't need to apologize for their skills, and that they don't need to always focus on grammar, or there are other aspects of writing that they can work on. Kat, if you would like to share.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kat Bell. I'm with Antioch University. I do a lot of work with faculty members and staff members, as well as workshops with students. And one of the things that I try to stress in those workshops is that, especially in early parts of the draft, you can write in whatever language you want to write. If you can't get the words that you want in English the first time, don't. Just worry about, if you are processing in Tagalog, write in Tagalog, because that is going to feel more comfortable. You can go back and reconsider and revise later. But, we talk with our faculty members about Gloria Anzaldúa and writing in the borderlands, and what it means to use your own language, your home language, and your language of nurture as a place of resistance, at the same time that you're reaffirming the fact that you have great ideas. It doesn't matter if I, as the writing center person, understand absolutely everything in that first draft. You can always go back and add to it as your writing gets more clear. And I think that has been a really freeing idea for a lot of our students who feel a lot of pressure to write in English and write perfectly in English the first time, because that's what they seem to see their classmates doing, when even for their classmates, a lot of that cognitive labor is invisible to anybody who's just looking at a paper or a draft in peer review or a discussion post.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that translingual approach to the writing process can often be very freeing for our multilingual writers. Bree.
Yeah, and thinking about both what Yinka and Kat were saying, I was also thinking about like this attitudinal aspect from the students. It's obviously not coming from nowhere, and thinking about the writing center as a space to potentially work through some of those things, those negative things that they've been hearing in other spaces, perhaps from instructors. There's that old chestnut of, and I still hear it from students who come in and their professor has told them that they won't read their paper until they go to a writing center tutor to fix it, or that they need to go there. So I think it's that yes, we're offering writing help, but a lot of times writing center tutors and writing centers in general are positioned to help students work through these negative attitudes and reactions they're getting from other places in the university.
Bree, it looks like we've lost our sign language interpreter.
Yes, Cheyenne is going to join us now.
Thank you, Cheyenne. I would love to hear maybe one more comment before we move on to our next section about sort of the history of L2 English writing instruction and how the writing center factors into this. Does anyone have any last comments before we move on to talking about feedback? Eric.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Wonderful. So I think an important kind of movement related to L2 and maybe to all students, I'll try and go a little slower, I apologize, is that this idea of drawing on or seeing a student's familiarity with other languages as not a deficit, but as like another resource tool, right? So really looking at the students holistically, looking at what kinds of language tools they already have available, right? Because if they're coming to us with an L1 already, or maybe multiple previous languages, right? They have a facility already with language, and that's something that should be taken into account when you're working with them on any particular kind of writing assignments.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, moving away from that deficit-based perspective of multilingual and ESL writers into what assets that having access to multiple languages provides is a really great perspective to have. So we've established our knowledge of ESL writers and the biases they face by being L2 writers and having other marginalized identities. But now we're going to change topics for a moment to talk about feedback. I've provided a fairly rudimentary definition of feedback on the handout, but if this definition doesn't mesh with yours, I'm happy to hear changes to contextualize this discussion for you. What I've provided defines feedback as input or response to specific material or stimuli. In this environment, this refers to the writing input and suggestions that writing center tutors provide in response to writing. With this in mind, and any additions or changes you would like to make to personalize this definition, let's talk about what feedback is to you and what form it takes in our writing centers. I've provided some discussion questions, but others posed are also welcome. What forms and modalities does feedback take in your writing center? Are tutors encouraged to provide feedback in ways that are unconventional? How do you see tutors using verbal, written, visual, and tactile feedback, both in person and virtually? And these questions are now also in the chat. And I, once again, open it up to discussion. Bree.
Yeah, so something we're currently, I'm kind of doing a study in my center right now, and thinking about the ways that online interfaces are shaping the kinds of feedbacks that are available, the kinds of feedback that tutors are able to offer in online sessions. So for example, a lot of centers, including our own, use WC Online. And WC Online's whiteboard doesn't have you can't have the cursor visible. And that can sometimes be really limiting. So a lot of folks end up using things like Google Docs, where you're able to kind of highlight specific sections of text and have it be more immediately available. And I was thinking of that as it's a visual move, but also it can be tactile in allowing or asking the student to hover over particular parts of the text and focus in on those moments. So yeah, I was thinking about that specifically in relation to L2 learners. And I think a lot of times what I've noticed is because of the way L2 learners have kind of come into the language, they have a lot more of that meta language to discuss what the function of the language is that sometimes L1 tutors don't have. So getting into that nitty gritty and being able to focus in on it, I think that kind of maybe goes back to Eric's point about there's a co-learning happening. It's an additional repertoire, and tutors are learning in those moments as well, that this is what the prepositional phrase is, or things like that they may have skipped over in L1 context.
Yeah, that's a really great insight to share, and how we can be using different modalities of feedback to bridge that gap between what tends to be that ESL background of the approach to what writing looks like, is learning all of the specific names and terms for these things. And then what I call in L1 English writers, functional language blindness, where we never learn all of these nitty-gritty terms for things that we just picked up as children. Other thoughts about feedback? Yinka?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm thinking about the color we discussed in the previous section, because as an L2 learner, sometimes when you give me lots of feedback, and then I remember we use the red pen, my teachers use the red pen, and that alone is you get your feedback and you are so disappointed with yourself. So just thinking about that now, I think being mindful of overwhelming my students with feedback, especially when you have to highlight and put a lot of comments. I'm just being critical about that now, that is something to consider, especially when you're working with ESL. You want to really help them, but you must be mindful of the color you're using and the amount of feedback you're giving. And I also think I understand that when you also use images and not just the written feedback. So sometimes I've had to take papers, for instance, to draw, to map out things, and they feel like, oh yeah, that's helpful. So I know this is limited if we are online, especially when I'm not good with graphics, designs and all of that, but just looking for other ways of giving feedback in addition to the written has always been helpful.
Thank you so much for that insight. Yeah, it's great to see how important visual feedback can be, even down to just the color of your feedback can really drastically change how someone might feel about that feedback, or how it might make them feel disheartened or empowered by what they're seeing. Amanda?
Hello, folks. Amanda Tomanek. I work at the California State University San Marcos Campus Writing Center, and my background actually started in ESL, and then I transitioned into writing center work. So I'm kind of coming at this from a different angle than other folks might be. When Yinka was talking about the overwhelming feedback that students can sometimes get, I realized that we had accidentally kind of helped that problem in our writing center with the asynchronous feedback that we provide. Because we only want our tutors to spend maximum 45 minutes with an asynchronous feedback document, in the form that students use to upload their paper, we ask them to identify just 3 questions that they'd like the tutor to focus on. And that has kind of helped the tutor not put all of the comments on there. If the student does ask for grammar, which is common with our multilingual writers, often the tutor, and I've helped them with this, will choose just one area of grammar or help the student recognize a pattern of error. And we use Microsoft Word to give those comments and feedback. And on the multimodal side, we've tried to use color highlighting. So a tutor might highlight something with subject-verb agreement in, let's say, blue. And then if there are issues with transitional words, they might highlight that in yellow, for example. Trying to stay away from red, right? We've got the red pen issue in the Writing Center world that we've discussed before. But I feel like the limitations of time have really helped us with not overwhelming some of the students with the feedback.
Thank you for that input. Kat?
Yeah, so something that has been working pretty well with our sessions, which are run through Zoom, is encouraging students to go ahead and record the session. There shouldn't be anything that our consultants are doing in a live session that would be terrible to record. If something is happening, that also provides us with a way to like go back and address any concerns, particularly around microaggressions. But asking students if they want to record so that they've got a record and can revisit it later, that allows them to process again on their own. And then sometimes just giving a little lesson on how to save the chat so that any resources that we share go either into the chat or into a Google Doc that we both can see. So we found that has been really helpful because then they have synchronous and asynchronous modes to visit, as well as their Google Doc that they're using or whatever they've shared with their screen.
That sounds like a wonderful way to turn these tutoring sessions into an additional reference for students. All right, so continuing on, keeping in mind feedback as we continue moving through, because we only have 45 minutes. In the call for proposals for the 2023 OWCA conference, the OWCA uses a definition of multimodality, the theme, taken from the seminal New London Group piece, A Pedagogy of Multiliteracies, Designing Social Futures. The definition of multimodal that the OWCA has given us from this writing states that communication is multimodal when it draws on a combination of linguistic, visual, audio, gestural, or spatial modes. While multimodality is critical in the development of modern communication, I would like to draw attention to the fact that the New London Group identified multiliteracy as the crux of a modern pedagogy on literacy and communication, which they define as the multiplicity of communications, channels, and media, and the increasing saliency of cultural and linguistic diversity. Thus, this idea of linguistic diversity and a comprehensive inclusion of writers of all language backgrounds has been included in this discussion since the beginning. With this in mind, let's take some time to discuss the questions on the handout for this section. What do you define multimodality as? Do you think the definition and use has changed much since the 1996 New London discussion on the term? How do we contextualize multimodality in regard to L2 writers? Should we be contextualizing this as multiliteracy instead, as the New London Group does? Where do we see multimodality in our writing centers? Assignments, appointment formats, feedback, resources? What benefit does multimodality provide to both tutors and writers? How do they change writing tutoring? And if there are other things outside of these questions that you want to input on multimodality or multiliteracy, I'm happy to hear them. Do you have any questions on the terms or would like additional input? Okay, Kat, thank you.
Sorry, I get really anxious sitting with wait times. But what I was thinking about for the very last question, with what benefit does multimodality provide to both tutors and writers? How do they change writing tutoring? What's been resonating with me, not only in my own center, but across today's conference, is that multimodality increases our accessibility. Right. It allows us to meet students where they are with their particular needs. It allows them to advocate for themselves, because one of the things that I don't think that we have necessarily talked about is what happens when we get L2 writers, culturally and linguistically diverse writers, who also have intersections with various types of disabilities, and they need additional support. That maybe color coding won't work. Maybe they need an audio recording to make sure that they can hear what's going on and how it might be perceived by a reader who's looking at it. So I think that really for me, the multimodality opens up learning to a huge number of students who might not seek it out otherwise. I also think that being able to put voiceovers or small video clips into Word documents or on Google Drive is very helpful for students who have high anxiety and want that personal feedback, but don't necessarily have the bandwidth to engage one-on-one in a synchronous session, but still could benefit from hearing another human talk to them in kind ways about their writing.
Thank you so much for that input. It's always great to keep in mind all of the intersecting identities that exist amongst our students, and that especially with our ESL writers, these language skills don't all grow or develop at the same level. So you're not going to develop your speaking, writing, listening, reading skills all at the exact same level. So this multimodality of feedback can often make sure that the feedback that we want to be giving is accessible and understandable in a way that it works best for our students. Other input on multimodality or multiliteracy? Jay Dunham.
Hi, so I'm also at Antioch with Kat, and I just wanted to comment on our virtual writing center, which I am the director of. We mainly give feedback in writing, and so we're giving written comments for people. The way that we handle multimodality, where we aren't doing video sessions or audio along with that writing, is that we try to present the material that we are giving to people in 3 completely different ways. We start with a discursive letter and give the writer the categories of feedback that we're giving in that letter. And then we make comments throughout the document, and we'll label those comments in many cases, especially for ELL writers. We'll label those comments with what category that comment fits with, so that the writer can more easily see, oh, this is a comment about paragraph structure, this is a comment about sentence structure, and have a better understanding of how those connect. And then we try to give just like little bite-sized next step kind of things at the end of the document. So even though we aren't doing multimodality in a very like literal way, because all of the feedback is in words, we're still trying to present it in different ways throughout that.
Thank you for your input. Yeah, it's always good to keep in mind, even if we're restricted in some way through our feedback, how can we make this more accessible, or how can we make this work for a larger variety of students? Yinka?
Yeah, for me, we discuss multimodality a lot, but I also think that instructors, we are not so empowered to give multimodal feedback. One, because of the structure or system that has been the favor for the written form of writing. So it's always hard. And because some instructors or tutors also feel like they don't have that technical skill to give support for such writing. So I personally will always shy from multimodal feedback, but I just think we have to embrace that fear, knowing that our world is becoming more multimodal. And I think about the kind of real writing students will do when they leave the campus. So if they sense that we cannot engage them at that level of multimodality, they will also be comfortable with the written feedback, work, and they don't want to explore more of multimodal projects. So there is fear for the instructors that we are not equipped to do the work, and maybe also the labor that it's going to take to put all of these things together.
Yeah, thank you for that input. Yeah, we're still moving towards multimodality, even as it becomes more of the norm. There's still a lot of leaps and bounds to be made moving towards it. Bree?
Yeah, in terms of thinking about like multimodality and how it is functioning within the center, I think in thinking about this definitional question, I think part of what we need to consider is like what we've done is always already multimodal. So like even in thinking about font choices, like even if it's like just a linguistic alphabetic text, like there are still visual choices that are integrated into that, and that's already multimodal. And again, I'm thinking about how technology intersects with some of these questions. And yes, there are things that are more overtly or recognizably multimodal. So like asynchronous screencast feedback, things like that. But even in the level of just text on the page, there can still be some multimodal integration. A smiley face is multimodal. Again, going back to like that idea of like color choices to highlight things. So even if there are technical limitations, and I agree that there are a lot of technical, like technology affords and constrains us in specific ways. And institutional technologies, the licenses that we've been allowed to buy, like the programs we've been integrating into our centers, those can shape the kinds of feedback that we offer. And I think it's important to get tutors to consider what are the possibilities in these tools. How can we think beyond just words on the page?
Great, thank you so much for that input. Yeah, sometimes the technology that we have available to us can be both helpful in striving towards this and a hindrance. So Eric, I see your hand, but I'm gonna move on to just our next section. If you can hold that thought, we don't have too much time, but with the shared understanding of multimodality or multiliteracy, if you find that term to be more emblematic of the work and research you would like to do in your writing center, I'd like to highlight some of the existing research identifying the benefits of multimodal approaches for L2 writers. In meaning making, multimodal representation, and transformative pedagogy, and exploration of meaning construction instructional practices in an ESL high school classroom, researcher Lasisi Ajayi finds that the use of visuals as a tool facilitates meaning making for ESL students. In visual aids and multimedia in second language acquisition, English language teaching, researcher Noha Halwani found that ESL students' reading and writing improved when instructors used visual aids, and they also became more interactive in the classroom with the use of visual aids. The value of visual aids is further solidified in I See What You Mean, Using Visuals to Teach Metaphoric Thinking in Reading and Writing by Rebecca Gorman and Gloria Schultz-Eastman, which notes that visuals and color theory aid in the teaching of metaphors, word connotation, and descriptive language, which are all challenging features of the English language to learn as an L2 speaker. While much of this research is occurring in the ESL classroom, we can see that the use of multimodal educational tools, both by instructors and learners, is specifically beneficial to L2 writers. In addition to this research, consider your own experiences with and using multimodal tools and approaches in writing tutoring. Consider as well the experiences you have had tutoring English writing with L2 writers. The vast majority of our help is provided through our feedback, in whatever form it takes. This feedback is also as close as tutors usually get to occupying an instructor role and providing the opportunity to explain most topics in writing. So with this in mind, I would love to hear your thoughts on how multimodal feedback is specifically helpful to our ESL writers, and also consider what avenues do we see in developing comprehensive multimodality in our tutoring tools and approaches. How can we use multimodal feedback to provide more individualized writing guidance and resources to L2 English writers? How should this feedback deviate from resources that exist for L1 English writers? And in what ways do multimodal tutor responses and feedback make writing more accessible and diverse? Eric.
So I'm doing some research on asynchronous feedback. And so one really interesting finding that's occurred with one of my studies participants is they used the Microsoft Word's read aloud feature as they were giving feedback, which I've never seen before, and I found that very intriguing. And so when I asked them, why they used this read aloud feature, they responded, it was easier for me to process, right? Because in a face-to-face session, they would read that document aloud anyway. And this was their way of, I think, trying to translate that tactic to help them form the feedback. So I'm wondering, perhaps there are ways to incorporate multimodality into the strategies we use when we provide feedback for asynchronous sessions.
That's very insightful. Yeah, being able to actually hear your writing and your feedback, to process it in a different way from reading it, and finding ways to incorporate that into feedback. Oh, I have a message. I'm not sure if you want me to share your name, but someone has messaged me. I'd love to hear examples of visual feedback folks have used if anyone wants to share. So what type of visual feedback are you using in your writing centers, in addition to what type of multimodal feedback are you thinking about developing? I can share here at Texas A&M's Writing Center, we have whiteboards in all of our session rooms that we use frequently to demonstrate the connections between ideas or to draw up diagrams for certain things. Are there multimodal approaches that people are using or thinking about developing for their ESL writers?
I can share very briefly. I saw the use of Post-its, like you put your ideas on the board. If you want to teach, for instance, connecting ideas, for instance, you can ask them to piece apart their thoughts, then put it. You can do it with any material. That way they can see at the same time they are highly interactive with whatever you're teaching them, whatever you are supporting them with.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Just wanted to turn back a little bit to Eric's comments, and I think loop in maybe this current idea about examples, kind of that example of like, I didn't even know that Microsoft Word had a read aloud function. So it reminded me, there was a piece by Anna Worm that was in the Computers and Writing Conference proceedings, I think, where she talks about using the interface in sessions to kind of show possibilities and as a pedagogical tool. And I think thinking about those practices that work in an in-person context, like Post-its, thinking about what are the tools you have access to online and how could those kinds of experiences maybe be recreated. Just thinking maybe like Jamboard on Google, or potentially like PowerPoint slides. But just thinking again about those interfaces and finding new possibilities in the technologies that we do have access to.
Yes, thank you for sharing. It's always good to learn more about the technology that we're using every day. I'm a big fan of the annotate function on Zoom to be able to draw on people's writing as we're moving through things. But we are just about out of time. So some final thoughts. Keeping in mind everything we have discussed so far, ESL writing, biases against L2 writers, feedback and multimodality, what are we leaving this discussion with? So here are a few questions to guide this introspection. How do you plan to evaluate the tutoring feedback that ESL writers receive in your writing center? In what ways can you improve the multimodality of feedback that is given in your writing center? And how can we address previously unmet writing needs through multimodal feedback? Does anyone have some final thoughts or things that they're planning on taking home to their writing centers with them? Mila?
Hi, yes, just reiterating a lot of what's already been said, reminding staff that everything we do is already multimodal and encouraging them to bring that idea into their conversations with multilingual students, because so many times, like Yinka said earlier, the fear and anxiety and sometimes even resistance that multilingual students have to do anything other than look at the sentence level concerns of their writing, that can really guide a session in ways that might not be the most productive. So just reminding staff to remind their students that multimodality is an avenue for us. I think that's what I'm taking away from today. So.
Thank you for sharing. Yinka?
Yeah, for me, I learned about the asynchronous. So I thought the asynchronous will just be the written, but I learned that we can incorporate audio, for instance, to make it also multimodal.
Yeah, it's great to keep in mind, even if we're doing that asynchronous tutoring where we're just receiving documents and sending them back, how much impact potential audio messages can have, what color we're providing our feedback in, and how we can incorporate visual data and feedback in addition to just written. Any last thoughts? All right. Thank you all for attending and participating in this discussion. I hope that you were able to gain something meaningful from it to take back to your writing center. If you have any further questions or comments, I can be reached at my email address, which is lwidman@tamu.edu, which I will also post in the Zoom chat. Thank you so much. And